September 3rd, 1945. Atsugi Airfield, 30 kilometers southwest of Tokyo. The air hung thick with the ghosts of kamikazes and the metallic tang of defeat. Below a bruised gray sky, Japanese soldiers stood in rigid, silent formation. Their uniforms were impeccably clean, their posture unbending, a final, fragile shield of military discipline against the raw humiliation of surrender. They had been told the Americans were demons, Oni with blue eyes and savage hearts. They were prepared for death, for summary execution in the dusty fields, for anything but this. They were not prepared for a stick of Wrigley's double mint gum, offered with a lazy, casual smile by a conqueror who seemed utterly unimpressed by the gravity of the moment. The first gesture was small, almost invisible against the vast backdrop of history unfolding. A young GI from Iowa, maybe 19 years old, tossing a small, silver-wrapped object to a wide-eyed child cowering by the runway. Then another gesture, and another. Soon, the stories began to multiply, spreading like a fever through the veins of a broken nation. Whispers in the unlit, lice-infested barracks of Yokohama. Rumors passed between skeletal figures on the starving streets of a firebombed Tokyo. Rumors of canned ham with pineapple rings. Rumors of peaches drenched in heavy syrup, a sweetness so intense it was said to make men weep. Rumors of real bitter coffee and endless cartons of Camel cigarettes. Nobody believed it. It was impossible. For a nation that had learned to make bread from acorns and sawdust, that had celebrated a single potato as a feast, the very idea was an absurdity. A cruel psychological torture. A hallucination born of 4 years of relentless, grinding hunger. But the rumors persisted, carried on the wind with the ashes of their cities. Rumors always persist. The official reports filed in cold steel cabinets under the authority of General Douglas MacArthur's Supreme Command for the Allied Powers are sterile clinical documents. They speak of logistical chains and the orderly distribution of surplus materiel to prevent civil unrest. The folder marked Scapin 47, Rations and Supply for Disarmed Forces, details the precise caloric content of K rations and the protocols for their use in demobilization centers. Another PSYOPS Directive 12B hints at fostering positive sentiment through non-essential provisions. It is the language of bureaucracy, a language of cold, military efficiency. But these files say nothing of the shock, nothing of the profound, soul-crushing disbelief that rippled through the populace. They say nothing of the secret war being waged, not with bayonets and bullets, but with processed cheese and chocolate. A war for the Japanese mind, a war for the Japanese soul. Was this an act of benevolence from a magnanimous victor? A conqueror's mercy? Or was it something else entirely? A calculated display of unimaginable power? A psychological weapon more devastating than any bomb, designed to obliterate the last remnants of the Yamato spirit. They whispered about it in the mess halls and the shadowy ruins that had once been geisha houses. The chocolate strategy? The caramel campaign. Some said the orders came directly from Washington, D.C., a policy crafted by university psychologists to pacify a defeated and volatile populace. Others insisted it was merely the spontaneous, thoughtless kindness of bored American soldiers, boys from Ohio and Texas who could not comprehend a world without plenty. Second Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka of the Imperial Army wrote in a hidden journal, "Today, an American gave my son a bar of sweet brown food. The boy did not know what to do. He bowed. The American laughed. I felt a shame deeper than any I knew on the battlefield. We were not defeated by their bombs. We were defeated by this." Corporal James Patterson, a 21-year-old from Akron, wrote home in a letter dated October 12th, 1945. "They look at a can of Spam like it's a bar of gold from heaven. I don't get it." But someone got it. Someone, somewhere in the vast machinery of the American occupation, understood the devastating power of a Hershey's bar. The first fear, of course, was poison. It was a logical, almost comforting assumption. The enemy would not simply give away food, not food like this. The rumors of tainted chocolate and cigarettes laced with disease spread as quickly as the rumors of their existence. It was a fear that dissipated with the first hesitant, trembling bite, the first cautious puff of a lucky strike, the first sip of Maxwell House coffee that scalded the tongue with its unfamiliar strength and bitter luxury. The poison was not in the food. The Japanese began to understand. The poison was the idea itself. The terrifying, undeniable idea of a nation so wealthy, so impossibly abundant, that it could treat as disposable trifles the very things for which a Japanese family would have traded their most precious heirlooms. The surrender had been signed on the deck of the USS Missouri, a political formality. An act of ink on paper witnessed by men in starched uniforms? But the true surrender, the deep psychological capitulation of an entire culture, happened in a million quiet, unrecorded moments across the scarred landscape of the home islands. It happened when a gaunt kamikaze pilot, trained for glorious death, tasted real sugar for the first time in 5 years. It happened when a mother wept at the sight of a can of Libby's corned beef hash, a miracle of meat and potatoes in a tin. This is the story of that surrender, a story pieced together from forgotten diaries, declassified communiques, and the fading, often contradictory memories of the vanquished and the victors. It is the story of how the sweet taste of American abundance became the final bitter acknowledgement of absolute defeat. Chapter 1, May 16, 1944, Hancock County, Iowa. The corn was already knee-high, a vast, rippling ocean of green under a sky the size of forever. It was a place of quiet faith and hard work, a place where the war was a distant rumble, a name in a newspaper, a gold star in a window. Nobody knew. Nobody in the nearby town of Algona, with its neat clapboard houses and its single movie theater, had any real idea. They saw the camp, but they did not understand the camp. That was the official story. Just a camp, a prisoner of war camp, one of hundreds sprouting across the American heartland like bitter mushrooms. It was called at Camp Algona. It sat on 287 acres of flat, unremarkable land bisected by U.S. Route 18. A place to hold the enemy until the fighting stopped. Simple. Clean. That was the story. It was a lie. 3,000 men. That's more than half the population of Algona. 3,000 German soldiers living behind barbed wire in the middle of Iowa. The locals saw them sometimes. Working in the fields, their gray-green uniforms faded under the prairie sun. They were thinning sugar beets, harvesting peas, detasseling corn. They were the enemy, defanged and put to use. Harmless, but not all of them. Not the ones in Compound 4. Compound 4 was different. The main camp was a sprawling, almost casual affair of wooden barracks and open space. But Compound 4 was a fortress within a fortress. It had its own double row of fencing, its own guard towers manned 24 hours a day, its own separate entrance guarded by MPs with shotguns, not just M1 rifles. The other prisoners, the common lancers and grizzled corporals from the Afrika Korps, they never went near it. They were told not to. They knew not to. Rumors existed. Of course, rumors existed. They slithered through the barracks at night, whispered in broken English and guttural German. The men in Compound 4 weren't soldiers, not really. They were officers, yes, but of a different kind. They didn't have the calloused hands of the infantry. They had the pale, soft hands of draftsmen, of engineers, of scientists. Someone said they were U-boat commanders. Someone else whispered they were Luftwaffe aces. The names were spoken like a secret prayer. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. Names that meant nothing to a farmer from Kossuth County. Names that meant everything to the Office of Strategic Services. And then there was him. 20-year-old Unteroffizier Paul Schultz. He was the ghost of Compound 4. He wasn't an officer. He didn't have the bearing of a scientist. He looked like a boy with pale blue eyes that seemed to see right through the wire, through the guards, through the endless miles of corn and back to a place of rubble and smoke. The camp commandant, Colonel Arthur T. Lobdell, a man who liked his paperwork in order, didn't know what to make of him. Schultz's file was thin, too thin. It said he was a radio operator, captured in Normandy, but he spoke English. Perfect, unaccented, idiomatic English. Where does a 20-year-old radio operator learn English like that? Maybe from a tutor in Hamburg? Maybe from a university exchange program? Maybe from command trips to London before the war even began. Nobody knew. But the facts were there. Facts are always truthful. A folder existed in a locked file cabinet in a sub-basement of the Pentagon. A thin, manila folder stamped with the highest security classification. The folder was called Project Tin Man. It had nothing to do with Oz. It had everything to do with the 120 men held in Compound 4, Camp Algona, Iowa. A single typed sheet inside the folder, an initial assessment from an observer whose name was blacked out, was dated April 2nd, 1944. It was chilling in its bureaucratic simplicity. The report stated, "Subjects exhibit high-level technical proficiency, unsuitable for agricultural labor. Specialized knowledge base confirmed in preliminary interviews. Recommend immediate isolation and further evaluation under Protocol 7. Protocol 7. Another name for a ghost. It didn't officially exist. It was a program designed to find needles in a haystack of prisoners. Not just any needles, the sharpest ones. The ones who knew things. The ones who had built the weapons that were still killing American boys on the beaches and in the skies of Europe. The other prisoners went out on trucks every morning at dawn. They went to the farms, they worked, they earned 80 cents a day in canteen scrip. They were tired and sunburnt and accounted for. But the men from Compound 4, they were different. Sometimes a black Ford sedan with government plates would roll up to the special gate. No markings, just dust and purpose. Men in dark suits and fedoras would get out. Not Army, not local police. FBI, maybe. Or something else. Something newer. They would go inside Compound 4 for hours. Sometimes a prisoner would be brought out. He wouldn't be in his uniform. He'd be wearing civilian clothes. He would get in the sedan, and it would drive away, heading east on Route 18. They never came back. This was not a holding pen. This was a mine. A human mine. The men in Washington weren't interested in holding these prisoners. They were interested in what was inside their heads. Blueprints, schematics, formulas, knowledge of jet engines, of guided missiles, of advanced radar systems. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the V-2 rocket, the acoustic torpedo, weapons that were years ahead of anything the Allies had. 600 men were at Peenemünde, the German rocket facility. 4,000 worked on the V-weapon program. Some of them had to have been captured. Some of them had to be here, in Iowa. That's how it began. The locals saw the lights. That was another thing. Electric lights burned in every room of the barracks in Compound 4, all night, even when the rest of the camp was dark. Sometimes a low hum would emanate from the compound, a sound that didn't belong in the Iowa night. A sound like a generator, but not quite. Once in late August, the power in the entire town of Algona went out for 3 hours. But out at the camp, the lights in Compound 4 never even flickered. Egard, a young private from Des Moines named Miller, told his girl in a letter. He wrote about the strange German who spoke English better than his high school teacher. The one who spent his days not in the yard, but in a special converted barracks filled with tables and blackboards. The one they called Schultz. Miller saw him once through a window, chalk in hand, surrounded by older, high-ranking officers who listened to him. Listened to a 20-year-old Unteroffizier. He was drawing something complex and curved. Miller said it looked like the wing of a futuristic airplane. The letter was intercepted by the base sensor. Private Miller was transferred to a weather station in the Aleutian Islands 2 days later. The page from his letter was added to the Project Tin Man file. And then the main thing started. One crisp October evening, A convoy of 5 sealed trucks, the kind used to transport high-value cargo, arrived at Compound 4. They weren't army trucks. They were backed up to a warehouse, and under the glare of floodlights, the men from the compound began loading heavy, cloth-wrapped crates. It took all night. Paul Schultz was there, directing the loading, speaking quietly to the men in suits, a clipboard in his hand. He wasn't a prisoner anymore, he was something else. Something was happening in the middle of the cornfields. Something secret and vital. The war was being fought in Normandy, in the Ardennes, in the skies over Germany. But another war, a silent, intellectual war, was being fought right here, in Hancock County, Iowa. And nobody knew that the real harvest wasn't in the fields. It was behind the wire. Chapter 2, May 16th, 1944. Hancock County, Iowa. The first rumor arrived with the fencing. Not the neat 3-strand barbed wire that kept the cattle in, but something else entirely. Something serious. Chain link and wood. And barbed wire. Lots and lots of barbed wire, coiled like angry serpents atop tall posts. They were building a cage in the middle of paradise. No one knew why. Sheriff John Brody, 52, watched from his Ford sedan, the engine idling, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of late afternoon sun. He had a face carved from the prairie itself, all lines and quiet resolve. The official word from Des Moines was a new subcamp, an overflow for the main prisoner of war facility at Algona. Just farm labor, they'd said. Extra hands for the beet and soybean fields. Brody chewed on an unlit cigar. He didn't believe it. Not for a second. The men building it weren't local. They were Army Corps of Engineers, their faces tight and sunburnt, their words clipped. They worked with a focused intensity that was unsettling. They worked as if they were building a vault, not a pen. The perimeter went up first, a stark metallic scar on the green landscape. Then the barracks. Simple tar paper structures, but one was different. Set apart. It had its own smaller fence. A cage within a cage. That's when the whispers started. On June 21st, the prisoners came. They arrived by train at the Britt siding, transferred to drab olive army trucks under the watchful eyes of military police with rifles held at port arms. 250 men. 250 Germans. The townspeople watched from a distance, a silent, fearful curiosity in their eyes. They expected monsters, the goose-stepping fanatics from the newsreels. They saw something else. They saw tired men in worn Feldgrau uniforms, their faces pale and thin. Boys, some of them. Old men, others. Schmidt, Meyer, Weber, Hoffman, Richter, Lang. A litany of the defeated. But Brody saw more. He had a knack for seeing things. It was his job. It was his curse. He stood near the depot, his Stetson pulled low. He watched them shuffle off the train. Most were Wehrmacht, regular army, their gazes downcast, their shoulders slumped. But about 20 of them were different. They were kept separate. They didn't shuffle. They walked. Their uniforms were cleaner, their boots less scuffed. They were Luftwaffe officers and NCOs, and they carried themselves with a strange, detached arrogance. They weren't looking at the ground. They were looking at the sky. Their eyes were clear. Too clear. A man in a dark civilian suit intercepted Brody. His name was Miller, from some acronymed agency in Washington, D.C. he'd refused to properly name. Miller had a city pallor and eyes that never seemed to blink. He smelled of mothballs and authority. "Just a standard procedure, Sheriff," Miller said, his voice a low, smooth hum. "We're segregating a few technical personnel, for their own safety." Brody grunted. "Safety from what? The local 4-H club?" Miller offered a thin, reptile-like smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "From themselves, Sheriff. From themselves." The official manifest which Brody had demanded to see was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. The folder was called Project Daukni-4B, Agricultural Support Detachment. It listed 250 prisoners of war, designated for general labor. General labor. Brody thought of the 20 men who were immediately marched to the special barracks, the cage within the cage. He'd seen their hands as they'd stepped off the trucks. No calluses, no grease under the nails. Soft hands. The hands of clerks, of students, of engineers. The hands of men who worked with their minds. A week passed. The main group of prisoners was sent out on supervised work details, their presence in the fields a bizarre and constant reminder of a distant war. They were quiet. They were compliant. But the other 20, they never left the wire. Brody would park his sedan on a rise overlooking the camp, binoculars to his eyes. He'd watch them. They had books. They had drafting tables, moved into the special barracks under cover of darkness. They had discussions, pointing at the sky, sketching on notepads. One of them was clearly the leader, Hauptmann Erich Vogel, 38, an aeronautical engineer from Stuttgart, according to a source Brody had in the county clerk's office, who'd seen a restricted personnel filing. Vogel had a sharp, bird-like face and an air of impatient genius. With him was Unteroffizier Klaus Richter, a physicist from Leipzig, and Oberleutnant Hans Ziegler, a specialist in rocketry, they whispered in the main barracks. They whispered his name with a mixture of awe and fear. Ziegler, Richter, Vogel, Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. Names that meant nothing to Hancock County. Names that meant everything to someone. But who? The tension began to grade upwards. Little things. The Army trucks that arrived now came only at night. No headlights until they were inside the gate. They carried heavy wooden crates, no company names, no return addresses. Just stenciled numbers in a single stark symbol. A raven, its wings outstretched. Brody saw at once a crate briefly illuminated by a guard's swinging flashlight. A black raven. He drove to the camp gate the next morning. Miller was there, overseeing a supply delivery. "Those nighttime visitors," Brody said, keeping his voice level. "They bringing in more of that agricultural support?" Miller turned slowly. His eyes were flat, like two polished stones. "That's a military matter, Sheriff." "This is my county, Miller. Everything that happens in it is my matter." "Not anymore." Miller's voice was quiet, but it held a chilling finality. "Your jurisdiction ends at this fence. This is now federal property. This is a matter of national security." National security. The two words Washington used to build walls and bury secrets. The break came on July 12th. A summer storm, a true Iowa gully washer, turned the camp's access road into a river of mud. An Army truck, one of the nighttime visitors, got stuck. There was shouting, cursing, the roar of a spinning engine. Brody was 200 yards away, parked in the dark, watching, waiting. He'd been doing that a lot. In the chaos of trying to free the truck, a briefcase fell from the cab. It burst open, disgorging a sheaf of papers into the mud in the driving rain. A soldier scrambled, frantically gathering them, but he missed one. One single sheet plastered to the wet earth by the downpour. After the truck was finally freed and rumbled into the compound, after the shouting died and the gates clanged shut, Brody waited. 10 minutes. 20. Then he got out of his car. He walked to the spot, his boots sinking in the mire. He found it, a sodden, flimsy piece of paper. He carefully peeled it from the mud, shielding it from the rain, and carried it back to his car. Under the weak glow of the dome light, he unfolded it. Most of it was illegible, a mess of running ink. But the top was protected by a fold. The header was stark, typed in capital letters, underlined twice. Top secret, eyes only. And below that, a project title. A name that made no sense. A name that sent a cold dread coiling in his stomach. A dread that had nothing to do with the war they were fighting, and everything to do with the one to come. The report stated, Project Nightingale, Phase 1, Asset Integration. Asset integration, not prisoners, assets. Brody stared at the words, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof of his Ford. He looked toward the camp. toward the cage within a cage, where the lights of the special barracks burned brightly against the stormy darkness, even at dawn, even in peacetime. And then the main thing started. Chapter 3, June 2nd, 1944. Algona, Iowa. The men came after the fences. They came in the dead of night, on trains with blacked-out windows that didn't whistle for the crossing at Kossuth Street. The sound was just a low rumble, a hiss of steam, and then a grinding silence that settled over the sleeping farm town. Nobody saw them arrive, not really. Just shadows moving against other shadows. Men in uniform, but not our uniform. Hundreds of them. Maybe 1,000. 1,000 Germans in the heart of Iowa. Sheriff Eli Miller, 52 years old and with a bad knee from a tractor accident in his youth, watched from his patrol car parked half a mile away on a dirt access road. He had been told to stay away. An order from a man in a crisp suit who smelled of Washington, D.C. and stale coffee. An Army captain. Captain James Albright, Quartermaster Corps. That's what his card said. But his eyes said something else entirely. Something cold and watchful. Miller was the law in Kossuth County, but not here. Not tonight. The official file landed on Sheriff Miller's desk the next morning. It was thin. Too thin. The folder was called Operation Corn Belt. A simple prisoner of war branch camp, the memo stated. The prisoners were to be used for agricultural labor. To help with the harvest. It made a kind of sense. All the local boys were overseas, in England, in Italy, on islands with names nobody could pronounce. The farms needed hands. But these were not the hands of farmers. The first time Miller saw them in the daylight, they were marching from the newly erected barracks to the cordoned-off section in the center of the camp. The section with the double fence. The section with the guard towers that faced inward as much as outward. They were Wehrmacht mostly, their uniforms dyed a drab, telltale blue. But the men themselves, they were different. Some were hollow-cheeked boys, barely 20, with the dazed look of the recently captured. But others were older, 40, 50. They walked with a straight-backed purpose that had nothing to do with defeat. Their faces were not the faces of common soldiers. They were the faces you'd see in a university lecture hall, in an engineering firm, in a laboratory. Sharp, intelligent, assessing. The rumors started in town almost immediately. Whispers over the counter at Thistle's General Store. Muffled conversations in the pews at First Lutheran. They said the camp was more than a camp. Someone who knew someone working construction out there said the prisoners weren't digging irrigation ditches. They were laying concrete. Strange, deep foundations. They were running electrical conduits thick as a man's arm, far more power than a simple camp would ever need. Electric lights burned in the inner compound all night long, even when the rest of the camp was dark. Even when the town was asleep, 1,000 Germans, 1,000 mouths to feed. The manifest given to the sheriff was incomplete. He knew it was. The names were a roll call of the German heartland: Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. But there were gaps, missing numbers. Pages that felt like they had been carefully removed. He drove past the camp every day. The official story was agricultural support, but he never saw a single prisoner leave the main gate to work a farm. Not one. They stayed inside. Always inside. The work was there. The work was the secret. One evening, Deputy Ray Carlson, young and eager, brought him a tidbit. Ray's cousin was a supply truck driver for the Army, running goods from the Des Moines depot. The cousin said strange cargo was being routed to the Algona spur line. Not food, not clothing, not medical supplies. Crates marked with stencils. Not Army stencils. Corporate stencils. General Electric, Westinghouse, Dow Chemical, and heavy water. Drums of it. The cousin didn't know what heavy water was. Just that it was heavy. And that the paperwork for it was signed by a civilian. A Dr. Eris Thorne. A physicist, someone whispered. A physicist from Chicago. Why would a physicist from Chicago need German prisoners and drums of heavy water in the middle of an Iowa cornfield? The tension in the county grew thicker than the summer humidity. It was a silent, creeping thing. The farmers were grateful for a camp that kept to itself, but they were also suspicious. They saw the glow in the sky at night. They heard the low, mechanical hum that sometimes carried on the wind, a sound that was not a tractor or a combine. It was a constant, low-frequency thrum, a vibration you felt in your teeth. It was the sound of something being built, or something being woken up. Sheriff Miller couldn't let it go. It was his county, his people. The man from Washington could have his secrets, but secrets had a way of spilling, and when they spilled, it was the local lawman who had to clean up the mess. One night, a week into July, he used an old hunting trail to approach the camp from the west, through a patch of dense woods that bordered the perimeter. He lay on his belly in the damp earth, the smell of decaying leaves in his nostrils, and watched through a pair of binoculars. He saw them, not the regular prisoners. The others, the specialists. They were working under portable floodlights in the central compound. A concrete disc, huge and perfectly circular, now dominated the space. In its center was a deep, reinforced pit. Men in white coats in a POW camp, were directing the prisoners, pointing at schematics, taking measurements with calipers and micrometers. And standing among them, a tall man in civilian clothes, was the physicist. Eris Thorne. He wasn't directing, he was observing. His face was a mask of intense, almost fanatical concentration. A gust of wind blew a piece of paper off a makeshift table. It fluttered and danced in the light before getting snagged on the outer fence of the inner compound. A guard glanced at it, then looked away, bored. Miller waited. An hour. 2 hours. Until the shift changed and the lights in the compound were dimmed for a while. He crawled forward, his bad knee screaming in protest, his heart hammering against his ribs. He snagged the paper through the wire with a hooked branch. He didn't look at it until he was back in his locked office, with the blinds drawn and a single desk lamp burning. It was a blueprint. Not the full one, just a section detail. It showed a complex arrangement of wiring, of magnetic coils, of pipes labeled coolant intake and plasma conduit. It was gibberish to him. Engineering nonsense. But at the bottom, scrawled in pencil, was a notation. A single word. A word he had never seen before, written in a precise, angular script. It looked like this. Glock. Chapter 4. June 21st, 1944. Camp Algona, Iowa. They were Rommel's men. That was the first staggering truth. Not conscripts scraped from the bottom of the barrel, not weary old men from the Volkssturm. They were the real thing. The Deutsches Afrika Korps. The desert foxes captured in the sun-scorched plains of Tunisia and Libya, now standing in the humid, black earth heartland of America. The locals stared. They saw the crisp uniforms faded by a sun not found in Iowa. They saw the posture, the ramrod spines, the unnerving way their eyes scanned the horizon, as if searching for panzers in the cornfields. The official story was simple. It was clean. A labor shortage, the government said. Our boys are overseas, fighting for freedom. These prisoners will help with the harvest. A patriotic duty. For them and for us. It made sense. It was a neat, tidy box for a messy, complicated war. Nobody questioned it. Not at first. The men were marched out to the fields each morning. Their boots were caked in the same mud as the local farmhands. They picked corn. They detasseled it. They dug ditches for irrigation. They worked. Hard. The farmers, initially wary, grew to respect their discipline. These were not shirkers, these were soldiers. They followed orders, whether from a Hauptmann or a farmer named Olson. They worked from sunup to sundown. They earned their keep and scrip, 80 cents a day, redeemable at the camp canteen for cigarettes and Coca-Cola. A simple transaction. An honest day's work for an honest day's pay, even for the enemy. It was all very American, very straightforward. But the truth was not straightforward. The truth was never straightforward. Because it was not about the corn, it was never about the corn. The first crack in the official story was their specialization. An Army Provost Marshal's report, dated June 10th and buried in a file cabinet in Omaha, listed the initial manifest. The file was designated Project Hawkeye. It was a dry, bureaucratic document, full of numbers and codes. But the codes told a story. They told a story that had nothing to do with agriculture. There were the expected infantrymen, the drivers, the artillery gunners. But they were the minority. The list went on and on. Optics specialists, radio engineers from the Funk Company, metallurgists, draftsmen, master machinists, 2 chemists with doctorates from Heidelberg University. There was even a naval architect, a man named Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Kessler, a U-boat designer captured not in the desert, but fished out of the cold North Atlantic. Why was a U-boat architect being sent to detassel corn in Iowa? Nobody asked. It was not a question one was supposed to ask. The rumors among the American guards started as whispers. Whispers in the mess hall over lukewarm coffee. Whispers during the lonely night shifts in the towers. These men weren't just from Africa. Some had arrived on later trains. Trains that came from the East Coast, from Fort Hunt, Virginia. The interrogation center, the place they called P.O. Box 1142. A place that didn't officially exist. They whispered about men who spoke flawless English, who carried no papers, who were separated from the main group immediately upon arrival. Who were they? Spies? Defectors? Something else? Maybe from the Luftwaffe's research division at Rechlin? Maybe from Peenemünde? The whispers were formless, ghosts of conversations that vanished when an officer walked by. And then the main thing started. In Barrack D7 at the far western edge of the camp, the windows were blacked out. Not with paint, but with heavy wooden shutters nailed shut from the inside. A double guard was posted at the door, day and night. The guards were from a different unit, a special detachment from the Army Corps of Engineers, men who didn't talk to anyone. From this barrack, no prisoners emerged in the morning to work the fields. The official roster listed them as unfit for labor, medical exemptions. But lights burned in Barrack D7 all night, every night. A low, persistent hum emanated from it, a sound that made the dogs in the nearby farms whine and pace. Sometimes a truck would arrive after midnight, a heavy-set 6x6 with its canvas pulled tight, delivering crates that were unloaded under armed guard. The crates were not from the quartermaster. They bore no markings except for a single stenciled letter. A W. For Washington? For Westinghouse? For Wunderwaffe? The whispers got more specific. They coalesced around a single man. Not the highest-ranking officer, not the captured Oberst who served as the official camp leader. No, this man was a Hauptmann, a captain. Jürgen Richter, 42 years old, an engineer from the 21st Panzer Division. He had a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a remnant of a British shell at El Alamein. Richter didn't work in the fields. He didn't speak to the farmers. He was one of the men in Barrack D7. He was seen on rare occasions walking the perimeter with American officers. Not guards. Officers. Men in crisp khakis with eagles on their shoulders who flew in from somewhere else. They weren't interrogating him. They were talking. Pointing at schematics, arguing. Richter's face was always the same, a mask of cold, intellectual focus. He wasn't a prisoner, he was a colleague. It was not about the corn, it was never about the corn. A folder, thick and bound in red leatherette, sat on a desk in a locked office in the Pentagon. Its cover read, Project Hawkeye, Addendum 4. Inside were photographs, not of prisoners in a field, photographs of complex diagrams, of gyroscopes, of high-frequency generators, of strange bell-shaped metal casings. There were names, a list of German scientists and technicians, all now residents of Camp Algona, Iowa. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. Next to each name was a notation, a specialty, cryogenics, heavy water separation, advanced telemetry, radar absorption. These were not the skills of a farmhand. These were the skills needed to build a new kind of weapon. A very new, very secret kind of weapon. One of the American guards, a private first class from Des Moines named Miller, got a look inside Barrack D7 once. Just a glimpse. He was delivering a message and the inner door swung open for a second too long. He saw wiring, miles of it, snaking across the floor and up the walls, a copper jungle. He saw men in white lab coats, German prisoners hunched over workbenches. He saw a metal framework, circular, suspended from the ceiling by heavy chains. It was large, maybe 15 feet high, and it glowed. Not with a bright light, but with a faint violet corona, a sickly shimmer that made the air smell of ozone and thunderstorms. He saw Richter standing in the center of the room, staring up at the thing. The German officer turned and his eyes met Miller's for a single terrifying second. They were not the eyes of a defeated prisoner. They were the eyes of a creator. The door slammed shut. The officer Miller was with grabbed his arm, hard. "You saw nothing, soldier," the captain hissed. "You understand me? You saw a generator for the camp lights, that's all. A generator." But Miller knew what a generator looked like. They didn't hum like a million angry hornets. They didn't glow. And they certainly weren't shaped like a bell. That night, Private Miller was transferred to the Aleutians, effective immediately. He was gone by dawn. The work in Barrack D7 continued. The hum grew louder. The whispers among the remaining guards died down, replaced by a thick, palpable fear. They were no longer guarding prisoners of war. They were guarding a secret. A German secret being built on American soil with American money. A terrifying, impossible collaboration. Why? Why bring the enemy's best minds to the middle of nowhere? Why give them the tools to build their infernal machines? The questions hung in the humid Iowa air, unasked, unanswered. The project had an official name, a code name, Project Hawkeye. But the men inside, the engineers, the scientists, the guards who heard things in the dark, they had another name for what was taking shape in that blacked-out barrack, a name whispered from German lips. Die Glocke. And deep in the heart of America, the German bell had just begun to toll. July 2nd, 1944, the west bank of the Des Moines River. They were not breaking rocks. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The men of the Afrika Korps, Rommel's elite, were not put to hard labor on some dusty quarry or ditch-digging crew like the prisoners at other camps. They were artists, they were builders. They were creating something on the flat, unremarkable Iowa floodplain, and they were doing it with a terrifying precision. A German precision. The official story was simple. Camp Beautification. A project to keep the prisoners occupied, to prevent the slow rot of morale that gnawed at men behind wire. A letter from the camp commandant, Colonel Francis E. Resta, to the War Department in Washington, described it as a constructive recreational endeavor. But the men guarding them, the farm boys from Kossuth County and Hancock County, knew something was off. They could feel it in the air thick as the summer humidity. It wasn't recreation, it was a mission. His name was Edward Kaib, a Feldwebel, a sergeant, but he carried himself like a general. 42 years old, a former architect from Stuttgart who, the rumors said, had studied under Albert Speer before the war. Before Africa. Before the sand and the sun and the surrender at Tunis. Kaib was the architect of this new strange thing rising from the Iowa mud. He never smiled. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. He directed his crew of 50 hand-picked men with short, guttural commands. Schmidt, Hauser, Fischer, Weber, Klein, Lange. They moved like a single organism, a well-oiled machine of purpose. It was not the work of prisoners, it was the work of a guild and the materials. That was the second wrong thing. Trucks arrived not just with stone from the local riverbeds or sand from a nearby pit. They brought specific things: sacks of Portland cement from the Lehigh Company plant, crates of colored glass, blue and red and green, scavenged from somewhere. They collected things. Anything with color or shine. Tinfoil from cigarette packs, the metallic paper from Wrigley's gum wrappers, shards of broken bottles from the camp dump. To the American guards, it was junk, garbage. But in the hands of Kaibe's men, it became something else. Something sacred and unsettling. Sergeant Frank Miller, a 24-year-old from Britt, Iowa, watched them every day from his guard tower. He had a clear view of the entire construction site. He saw Kaibe sketching on a large drawing board, his lines impossibly straight. He saw the other men sorting the broken glass by color, by size, with the focus of diamond cutters. They spoke only in low German, fast, clipped. They never argued. They never slacked. There was only the work. The work was everything. That's how it began. The file in the camp commandant's office was thin. It was labeled Branch Project A4 Morale Improvement. It contained Kaibe's initial harmless-looking sketch and a few requisition forms for cement and basic tools. A whitewash. A fiction for the official record. They said there was another folder, a thicker one, kept not in Algona but in a locked safe in the 4th Service Command Headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska. That folder, they whispered, had a different name entirely. They called it the Grotto, a nativity scene. That's what they told everyone. A little piece of home for Christmas 6 months away. A tribute to the faith of the German soldier, but it grew. It grew with an unnatural speed. It was not some crude folk art project. Kaibe used a surveyor's transit to align the walls. A real one. Nobody knew where it came from. Maybe from MGU, the camp's makeshift German university. Maybe from one of the command trips to Des Moines. The structure began to take the shape of a small chapel, its walls embedded with a mosaic of stones and glittering glass. A 30-foot perimeter was established around the site. No American guards were allowed inside that perimeter. Orders from Washington, they were told. Orders from Washington to let German prisoners of war build a chapel in private. Nobody believed it, but the orders were there. Orders are always truthful. The figures came next. Kaibe's men began sculpting them out of a mixture of cement and plaster over wire frames. Mary, Joseph, the infant. Then came the shepherds, then the 3 kings. 6 figures, 8 figures, 12 figures. Each one a half-life-size masterpiece of haunting realism. Every fold of cloth in their robes was perfect. Every finger joint was articulated. Every face held an expression of profound, unreadable solemnity. This was not the work of amateurs. This was the work of masters. Masters of what? No one was sure. And then the main thing started. A rumor started in the American mess hall. A private named O'Connell swore he saw Kaibe working late one night under a single bare bulb. He wasn't sculpting, he was looking at a map. Not a map of the camp, not a map of Iowa. It was a map of the eastern seaboard of the United States. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. O'Connell, Schneider, Wagner, Kaufman. They all saw it. Maybe. Rumors existed. Sergeant Miller couldn't shake the feeling. The perfection was a lie. The piety was a mask. This wasn't about God. It was about something else. On the night of August 3rd, 1944, he decided to break the rules. The 30-foot perimeter. The orders from Washington. He waited until 2 in the morning, when the moon was a sliver behind the clouds and the only sound was the drone of cicadas. He slipped under the single strand of rope marking the boundary and walked into the heart of the project. The air was cold inside the half-finished structure. The plaster figures stood like silent, pale ghosts in the gloom. They watched him. He felt it. He ran his hand over the smooth, hard surface of the figures. They were heavy, solid. He tapped on the figure of Balthazar, the third king, the one holding a gift. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the dull thud of solid plaster. It was different. A resonance. He found the seam near the base almost invisible. A perfect hair-thin line. His fingers, calloused from farm work, traced it until he found a tiny indentation. He pulled out his pocket knife. The blade slipped into the crack. With a soft scraping sound, a section of the plaster came away in his hand. It wasn't hollow. Not entirely. Inside, nestled in a carefully molded cavity, was not a secret message. Not a hidden weapon. It was a small, leather-bound book filled with dense columns of numbers and chemical formulas. And beside it, a single, perfectly machined metal cylinder, 6 inches long, capped at both ends, and cold to the touch. July 2nd, 1944. The west bank of the Des Moines River. They were not breaking rocks. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The men of the Afrika Korps, Rommel's elite, were not put to hard labor. Not real hard labor. They were not swinging sledgehammers in a quarry or felling trees in the dense woods that crowded the river. Not here. Not this hand-picked group of 100 men. They were working with an unnerving, quiet precision that chilled the handful of American guards more than any open defiance ever could. The air buzzed with their focus. A focus that did not belong in a prisoner of war camp in the middle of Iowa. Something was being built, and it was not a bridge, it was not a dam. The official story was erosion control, a project to shore up the riverbank after the spring floods. That's what Captain Davis told his men. That's what the paperwork said. Paperwork filed in a cabinet, under a lock, in a room nobody ever entered. Erosion control. The Iowans downstream who saw the activity from a distance believed it. It made sense. The river was a fickle beast, but the guards on the perimeter, the men who watched them day in and day out, they knew. They knew this was a lie. You don't use theodolites and surveyors' transits to stop a riverbank from crumbling. You don't have an Oberleutnant with a degree in civil engineering from the University of Stuttgart pacing the mudflats with a roll of blueprints. The German officer was Franz Kessler, 32 years old, captured at El Alamein. His file said he was a cartographer, a map maker. Here, on the banks of a muddy Iowa river, he was conducting a symphony of earth and water. The rumors started in the mess hall, whispers over lukewarm coffee and stale bread. It's a U-boat pen, one private from Chicago insisted. A practice pen. They're going to teach our boys how to blow 'em up. Nobody believed him. A submarine pen in Iowa? It was absurd. It's a new kind of dam, another offered. Something secret. German engineering, see? We're stealing their ideas. That sounded more plausible, but it didn't explain the details. The tiny flags on sticks, the meticulous shaping of the terrain, the way they worked, Kramer, Vogel, Haas, Zimmerman, Lang, Fuchs. These were not laborers, they were artisans, sculptors. They moved earth not by the ton, but by the handful, patting it into place, measuring angles, checking levels. They were building something to a scale, a perfect miniature scale. Sergeant Frank Miller, a farmer from just outside Mason City, saw it most clearly. He was 41, too old for the front, a man who understood the land. He knew what it took to shape the earth to your will. And this wasn't farming. This wasn't erosion control. He'd spend hours watching through his binoculars from the small watchtower on the eastern bluff. The Germans worked in silence, a stark contrast to the boisterous American road crews Miller was used to. They carved out channels, they built up ridges. They used a strange mixture of river clay and straw to construct small, angular shapes. Hundreds of them. Tiny, perfect cubes and rectangles, no bigger than a shoebox. Bunkers. They were building bunkers. The folder in Captain Davis's office was thin. It was labeled Project Claymore, not Project Riverbank or Erosion Control Initiative. Project Claymore, a name that spoke of explosions and beach assaults. The authorization came from a sub-department of the Army Corps of Engineers that no one had ever heard of, a post office box in Washington, D.C. The orders were simple: provide the personnel requested by Oberleutnant Kessler, maintain security, and ask no questions. No questions at all. Captain Davis followed those orders. He followed them to the letter. His face was a mask of bland obedience. But at night, the guards heard him pacing his office. Back and forth. Back and forth. The project grew. Day by day, it spread across the designated 5-acre plot. It was a map. A three-dimensional map made of mud and clay and Iowa soil. A living map. Miller saw it take shape. He saw the gentle curve of a bay, the sharp jut of a peninsula, the distinct shapes of what had to be towns laid out street by tiny street. He had spent the winter of 1942 poring over maps of Europe in the local library, trying to understand where his nephew was fighting. His hands began to shake as he held the binoculars. He recognized the shape. It was impossible. It made no sense. But the facts were there. Facts are always truthful. He was looking at the coast of France, the Cotentin Peninsula. He could see it, the unmistakable thumb of land pointing into the English Channel. He focused the binoculars, his knuckles white. The Germans were placing their little clay buildings, not randomly. They were placing them according to Kessler's blueprints. Kessler would point, and a team of men would scurry to create a tiny machine gun nest. He would gesture, and they would carve out a miniature anti-tank ditch. They were recreating, with terrifying accuracy, the German coastal defenses. The Atlantic Wall. Why? The question screamed in Miller's mind. Why build a replica of the Atlantic Wall on the banks of the Des Moines River? Why use Rommel's own men to do it? It was a dress rehearsal. It had to be. A practice run for the invasion everyone knew was coming. Our boys were going to use this, to study it, to learn how to break it. That had to be the answer. It soothed the frantic edge of his fear. It almost made sense. Almost. And then the main thing started. On a hot July afternoon, under a sky white with humidity, Kessler unrolled a new set of plans. The work became even more frantic. A new group of prisoners was brought in, this time linguists. Men who spoke perfect English. They began painting signs. Tiny signs. Signs that read Rue de la Libération. Signs that marked fields and bridges. They were naming the streets, they were naming the towns. Miller zoomed his binoculars in on the largest cluster of miniature buildings, a place the Germans were spending most of their time reinforcing. He saw one of the new prisoners carefully paint a sign and place it at the entrance of the clay town. The letters were small but clear through the powerful lenses. Sainte Mère Église. Miller felt a cold dread wash over him, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He swept his binoculars across the miniature landscape. He saw the section of coastline marked Utah. He saw the one marked Omaha. They were building it all, the whole damn invasion site. He lowered the binoculars, his heart pounding a sick rhythm against his ribs. A dress rehearsal. For our boys, it had to be. He raised the binoculars one last time, scanning the whole of the project, a monstrous and intricate wound on the Iowa landscape. That's when he saw it. A detail so small, so insignificant, he'd missed it before. Kessler was handing out a new set of tiny flags, no bigger than a thumbnail, not the little red flags they used for marking survey points. These were different. They were flags of nations. He watched as a prisoner, a blond kid no older than 20, took one of the flags and walked to the miniature beachhead marked Omaha. The kid knelt in the mud, a strange expression on his face, something like reverence. He carefully pushed the tiny flagpole into the clay, right at the high tide mark. Miller zoomed in, twisting the focus dial until the image was crystal clear. The flag was not American. It wasn't British. It wasn't French. It was a swastika, and they were planting them all along the beaches. On the other side. Chapter 7, July 28th, 1944. The west bank of the Des Moines River. They were not breaking rocks. They were building. They were building with a furious, silent precision that unnerved the handful of American guards posted on the perimeter. First, the slab. A vast concrete foundation poured over acres of cleared Iowa farmland, a gray wound on the green earth. It was poured in sections with expansion joints and drainage culverts, planned with a geometric perfection that spoke not of farm work, but of sophisticated civil engineering. It made no sense. The heat was a physical weight. The air was thick with the smells of curing concrete and disturbed soil. A smell of creation, not destruction. And that was the second thing that felt wrong. The man in charge, Major Arthur Cunningham, a 46-year-old civil engineer pulled from his Des Moines firm by the Army Corps, would stand on the edge of the construction site for hours. He'd stare at the blueprints in his hand, then at the work unfolding before him. The papers were thin, fragile. The project folder was simply labeled Harvest Moon. A memo dated July 5th from the War Department had been clipped to the top page. It authorized the use of any and all materials. It authorized the conscription of German prisoners with specific skill sets. It authorized complete secrecy. The orders came from Washington, directly. No questions were to be asked, but Cunningham had questions. He had 1,000 questions. Because the Germans weren't just labor, that was the secret inside the secret. The men of the Afrika Korps, Rommel's elite, were not just hauling lumber and mixing concrete. They were consulting. They were directing. An Oberleutnant named Klaus Richter, a cartographer from Dresden before the war, would walk the grid lines with American surveyors, arguing in sharp, guttural English over angles measured to a fraction of a degree. A Hauptmann named Erich Vogel, a man who had helped design sections of the Siegfried Line, pointed out flaws in the timber framing for the skeletal structures that were beginning to rise from the concrete. They weren't prisoners, not in the usual sense. They were collaborators. They were experts, indispensable experts. The blueprints themselves were a mystery. They had arrived in a locked diplomatic pouch carried by a stern-faced colonel who stayed for less than an hour. Nobody knew where they came from. The whispers started in the mess tents, quiet theories spoken over weak coffee. Maybe from the OSS. Maybe from British intelligence. Some said a high-ranking German architect had defected, bringing the plans with him as his price of entry. Others claimed they were captured in a raid, a priceless intelligence coup. The official line was silence, a deep, profound silence. But the plans were perfect. Too perfect. They showed street widths, sewer main depths, curb heights, building layouts, even the specific pitch of the rooftops. It was the anatomy of a city laid bare on paper. A German city. Now the skeletons were taking shape. They were not buildings, they were facades. Like a Hollywood movie set, but built with the solidity of a fortress. Raw timber frames bolted directly into the concrete slab, outlining houses, shops, municipal buildings. There were no back walls. They were ghosts of structures open to the Iowa sky. The Germans worked with a grim familiarity. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. They moved through the phantom streets, calling out measurements, correcting angles, their faces unreadable. They knew these streets. That was the chilling part. They walked the chalk outlines on the concrete as if they were walking down the memory lanes of their own hometowns. This was not a new place to them. This was a place they were remembering into existence. It was a replica. The word began to circulate among the few American officers privy to the project's scope. A perfect 1-to-1 scale replica. Not an approximation, not a model. A meticulous, life-sized recreation. A street corner in Iowa was being built to the exact specifications of a street corner thousands of miles away, in the heart of the enemy's territory. They used German-made theodolites, brought in with the blueprints to ensure the angles were correct. They argued over the placement of a phantom fountain, the curve of a specific curb. It was madness. It was the most methodical, well-funded, and organized madness Major Cunningham had ever witnessed. $6 million. That was the initial budget. $6 million to build a ghost town in a cornfield. And then the main thing started. As the first few blocks of the city took shape, the purpose began to dawn on Cunningham, a slow, cold horror that had nothing to do with the Iowa humidity. The German experts weren't just rebuilding their homes, they were building them to be destroyed. He saw it in the way they specified certain roof materials, the way they insisted on particular types of window frames, the way Hauptmann Vogel consulted charts he kept in a worn leather satchel. They were building for a specific effect, an effect of fire, an effect of collapse. They were building a laboratory. The folder was labeled Harvest Moon. The project was unofficially nicknamed the German Village by the American crew. But one evening, under the pale glow of a single bulb in the planning shack, Cunningham was looking at the master blueprint. He saw the network of streets, the Tiergarten, the government district marked with a large X, and in the margin, next to a sprawling complex of ministry buildings, a name was scrawled in faint pencil. A name he knew from every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every intelligence briefing. One word: Berlin. They were building Berlin in the middle of America. And the only question left was why. What is the most devastating weapon in a nation's arsenal? Is it the one that shatters cities, the one that splits the atom, the one that turns oceans of men into silent fields of bone? Is it forged in the blast furnaces of industry and aimed with cold precision across a map? Or is it quieter, simpler, and infinitely more bewildering? Is it possible the most potent weapon of the Second World War was not a bomb, but a Hershey's chocolate bar? The official story of the end is written in ink and surrender documents, but the unwritten history lies in the quiet, shattering moments of disbelief. It is in the face of a Japanese lieutenant, his uniform still impeccably clean, his posture an unbending shield against humiliation, staring at a steaming plate of food he was told did not exist. It is in the archival silence surrounding the prisoners of Camp Algona, where the men of Rommel's elite Afrika Korps were not sent to quarries or logging crews. They were building something with a furious, silent precision that unnerved the local guards, a strange, intricate structure rising from the black Iowa earth. Sheriff John Brody saw it from his Ford sedan. He saw the men who arrived on blacked-out trains in the dead of night, expecting the barbarism promised by their own commanders. He saw them unload not into a hellscape, but into a puzzle of clean barracks, warm coffee, and ordered work that had no apparent punitive purpose. This was not mercy. It was a message. This was not kindness. It was a strategy. A quiet, insidious campaign waged far from any front line. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with calories, not with bayonets, but with bewilderment. The objective was the complete dismantling of an enemy's reality. To unmake a soldier, you do not need to break his body. You need only to break his certainty, to shatter his worldview not with an explosion, but with a quiet, undeniable truth. The truth of a full stomach. The truth of a guard who offers a cigarette instead of a rifle butt. The truth that the foreign devils were not devils at all, but something far more confusing, simply people. They came as warriors of the emperor, their minds fortified with a mythology of sacrifice. They came as the desert foxes of the Führer, convinced of their own martial and racial superiority. They were prepared for starvation. They were prepared for torture. They were prepared for a death worthy of their cause. They were utterly, profoundly unprepared for 3 hot meals a day. They were unprepared for the polite farmer's wife who might offer a piece of pie to a work detail. Unprepared for the sheriff who watched them not with hatred, but with a weary, inscrutable curiosity. This was the true weapon, not material abundance. An abundance of cognitive dissonance. An abundance of humanity so unexpected it acted as a solvent on the iron convictions of ideology. The High Command in Tokyo and Berlin had built an entire psychological fortress around the concept of a brutal, monstrous enemy. And here, in the heartland of that enemy, the fortress was being dismantled, brick by bewildering brick. What happens to a man when the world he was sent to destroy saves him with its surplus? What does he tell his family when he returns home? Does he speak of the chocolate, the clean sheets, the strange, quiet work? Or does the shame of survival, the confusion of the experience, curdle into a lifelong silence? The archives in Washington and Tokyo and Berlin are vast, but they are not infinite. They do not contain the tremor in a man's hand as he accepts food from his sworn enemy. They do not record the late-night conversations in the barracks, the whispered questions, the slow erosion of a lifetime of belief. The numbers tell one story. So many prisoners processed, so many calories allocated, so many men repatriated in 1945 and 1946. The real story is in the transformations we can no longer trace, in how enemies became builders, in how hatred, starved of the brutality it needs to survive, began to dissolve in the face of inexplicable hospitality. The truth remains somewhere between the lines of the official reports, between the archival files marked miscellaneous, between the silence of the last surviving veterans. Some secrets die with those who kept them, but the questions they leave behind live forever. How do you continue to hate a ghost who feeds you? How do you fight an enemy whose most powerful weapon is the sweet, simple, undeniable taste of a world you were told could not possibly be real?